Missouri has gone wild about the murals at the State House. Native son Thomas Hart Benton presents his colorful history of Missouri to the governor. Already, 30,000 spectators have viewed the murals, and everybody has an opinion. Young and old alike love Huckleberry Finn, but here's one about that bad old outlaw Jesse James. Some people just don't like it. Mr. Benton responds, when you think of Missouri, you think of Jesse James, whether you like it or not.
There's many a son of Missouri been cussed and discussed in these halls, but none more than Thomas Hart Benton after he painted these walls. After he painted these walls, after he painted these walls, none more than Thomas Hart Benton after he painted these walls. Some of our state legislators didn't like what he showed of our state. The James boys and Frankie and Johnny, a baby's bare bottom and slaves. A baby's bare bottom and slaves. A baby's bare bottom and slaves. The James boys and Frankie and Johnny, a baby's bare bottom and slaves.
I was commissioned to make a history of Missouri, but a particular kind, a social history, which meant, as we conceived it, simply a history of the life of the people of Missouri, those who actually made Missouri. And it begins here with the pioneer world.
They came here from Kentucky and they came here from Virginia, came here from Tennessee. And they settled in the bottoms on the banks of the Missouri with the Indians and animals and trees. And the living wasn't easy, the food was tough and greasy, but the living was free. Oh, they were the pioneers, came here from far and near. And they lived off the fat of the land, and they lived by the skill of their hands, and they worked on their dreams.
Benton often said he'd experienced most of the stuff he painted on these walls, and what he didn't, his ancestors did. He was given the family name of his great-great-uncle, Thomas Hart Benton, one of Missouri's first senators. The senator was strong on westward expansion and deeply troubled by slavery. Tom Benton's mural depicts those issues and at the same time recapitulates the history of the nation from the days of the frontier to the rise of the modern city. Here, the nonchalant trader barters firewater for furs offered by an Osage Indian. Exploitation of the native population began on the eastern seaboard and continues in the heart of the continent. Dominance of the trader over the Indian is mirrored in the ascendance of the settler over his slave. Small-scale farmers worked alongside their slaves, if they owned any, and accomplished the Herculean task of clearing the wilderness during the 1830s. A romanticized image of prosperity before the Civil War is inserted in a small panel called a predella. Benton sometimes uses this Renaissance device to frame events from different times in one moment of the mural. The Pony Express left St. Joe on its 10-day journey to California, but it soon gave way to modern technology, the telegraph and railroad. Bible-based communities flourished in Missouri. St. Louis, Catholic from its French beginnings, built its own cathedral. Still, the progress of the state was entwined with an economy where the slave on the auction block was business as usual. Since the early 1730s, the French imported slaves from Santo Domingo to work the lead mines around St. Genevieve. A few expressionist strokes depict the cruelty of the overseer, a scene from hell on the American frontier. Mormons preached anti-slavery and other unpopular beliefs during the 1830s. Angry Missourians responded with tar and feathers and drove them from the state. As an alternative to the brutalities of history, Benton portrays harmony between the races. in a scene from a story written by a fellow Missourian.
There's a moon on the Mississippi River tonight, a side wheel steamboat making up time, raft drifting by with a bunch of drunk men. I'm catfishing with my old friend Jim. Call me Huckleberry Finn, Finn, Huckleberry Finn, Finn, Huckleberry Finn. Steamboat chimneys are spewing out sparks, fiddle music drifting by in the dark. Hoot owl calling from a cottonwood tree, this lonesome old river keeps it rolling. Call me Huckleberry Finn, Finn, Huckleberry Finn, Finn, Huckleberry Finn.
The story of a state cannot be really told without its mythology too. And part of this mythology was that erected by Mark Twain in his history of Huckleberry Finn. This story, there's so much a Missouri story that I felt that it had to go in.
The fate of slaves like Jim was decided in the nation by the Civil War. But Missourians were fighting over slavery a decade earlier in the border warfare with Kansas. During the war, Quantrill, Bloody Bill Anderson, and other guerrilla fighters ravaged this Union-controlled state of divided sympathies. In 1861, the pro-slavery governor tried to set up a Confederate state capital on the run in Neosho, only to be driven to Arkansas a few days later. One enduring effect of the Civil War was a lawlessness typified by a former Confederate partisan, Jesse James, a popular folk hero by the time of Benton's youth.
Jesse James, Jesse James, he robbed banks and he robbed trains. And the Pinkerton men tried to hunt him down, followed him around from town to town, never laid a hand on Jesse James. Jesse and Frank and the youngers and the rest who had fought for their families and given their best didn't have much choice but to turn to a life of crime. So they robbed from the people who was robbing their friends, like the fat cat bankers and the railroad men. Lots of people was secretly on their side.
When you think of Missouri, you think of Jesse James, whether you like it or not. I think they're still fighting the battle, though, whether he was a Robin Hood or just a plain ordinary bandit.
Jesse James, Jesse James, he robbed banks and he robbed trains. And the Pinkerton men tried to hunt him down, followed him around from town to town, never laid a hand on Jesse James.
Champ Clark is a typical Missourian and ideal
Tom
American.
Benton grew up in a town that remembered both the Civil War and Jesse James, in an era before women had the right to vote.
You see a regular country political meeting with my own father making the speech.
Maecenas Benton was elected to Congress in 1896 as a populist Democrat. For the next 8 years, he and his family divided their time between Washington and Missouri. Congressman Benton supported Missouri's Champ Clark, the Speaker of the House, in a run for the Democratic nomination for president.
The human wolves congregating about the national capital, seeking governmental advantage or aid in their nefarious designs. And when he encounters such a person on the floor of Congress, his wrath is unbottled and his indignation never subsides. Following his success in the speakership,
as far back as I can remember, I have traveled around this state of Missouri. When I was a kid, my father used to take me on his various campaigning trips. I got acquainted with the flamboyant early political life of Missouri. We have an Ozark farm up there with the sugar mill and the old-fashioned power, mule power that runs it. You have a wheat field with people cradling wheat below, which I've seen in my time in Missouri, but which of course is no more common to the state. Now in the immediate foreground, in front of the mule-drawn plow, you'll find two fellows working at with a cross-cut saw, two-handed saw. This is a sort of symbolical representation of the early lumbering industries.
Throughout the mural, the large hands, Huge feet and muscled torsos, reminiscent of Michelangelo, emphasized the labors of the working people who made Missouri. Benton painted them, as he said, large enough to be seen. Thomas Hart Benton was born on April 15, 1889, in the small town of Neosho in the southwestern corner of Missouri, only a few miles from the Indian Territory that became Oklahoma. He loved illustrated books, tales of the frontier, and railroad trains. He was only 8 when he drew the Katy Flyer. Steam locomotives were going to be a lifelong subject. He executed his first mural, when he was 6, on new wallpaper in the family home. That engine billowed charcoal smoke as it chugged up the steep grade of the staircase. His parents' reaction taught the boy early that mural art could be painfully controversial. Some patrons of the House of Lords, a saloon in Joplin, catapulted young Tom into his vocation as an artist when they noticed his fascination with a painting of a nude woman over the bar. They laughed at Shorty, which galled the 5'2" Benton. They challenged him to prove he was the artist he claimed to be, and prove it he did, by going straight to the office of the Joplin American and getting hired on the spot as the newspaper's cartoonist for $14 a week, the best pay he was to have in the service of art for the next 20 years. In the winter of 1907, at the age of 17, he boarded the Frisco for Chicago to attend the Art Institute. After a year and a half of classes he hated, Tom talked his parents into financing a trip abroad to study. He spent the next 3 years in Paris learning all the damned isms of modern art. Cézannism, Fauvism, Constructivism, and so forth. Then his mother showed up for a surprise visit bearing bad news. The money had run out. Besides, she disapproved of his bohemian life, which included a French mistress. So Benton returned to Missouri briefly, and then moved on to New York City, where he struggled to establish himself as an artist. During the First World War, Tom joined the Navy, where he was put to work sketching the new airplanes, the blimps, the dredges, the ships of the base at Norfolk. He saw America around him and abandoned the world of art for art's sake. After the war, Benton returned to New York and began painting subjects he hoped would attract the public's interest. This led to the idea of painting a history of the United States, the American historical epic, on more than a dozen large canvases. He became known as the mural painter without walls because he couldn't get any commissions from architects. In the early 20s, he married Rita Piacenza, a remarkable Italian woman who was to become the mainstay of his life. His big break came in 1930 when he painted America Today on the walls of the New School for Social Research in New York. He was paid in paint and publicity, which turned out to be enormous. His reputation was established. This self-portrait, done in 1926, shows the belligerent confidence he had in his art. By 1934, Benton was the foremost muralist in the United States. Because he was outspoken, he became the chief advocate of the regionalists, including Grant Wood and John Stuart Curry. Their art was representational, their subject matter, American. Tom took on a daunting commission from the state of Indiana for the 1933 Century of Progress exposition in Chicago. In 6 months, he researched, designed, and painted a mural 14 feet high and 256 feet long that celebrated the Hoosier State from the era of the Mound Builders to the Indianapolis 500. In 1935, after 24 years in New York, Benton had had it with life in the big city. He wanted to return to Missouri, and another mural commission would make that possible. Now, Missouri did not know it needed a mural, but Benton did. His brother Nat helped him lobby for the project.
We went down to Jeff City and had one of these hotel parties that lasted quite a good time at night, sounding out the various representatives of the state, and everybody seemed kind of to go along with the idea that the state should have a mural.
Tom figured an old political debt to his father led operatives of Boss Pendergast's Kansas City political machine to collaborate with Senator Barber of Springfield to support the bill for a Missouri mural. The legislature appropriated 16,000 Depression dollars, somewhat more than the governor's salary, for art. But Benton had to pay for the paint, the plywood, and all the other expenses, which came to about $12,000. The official title was A Social History of the State of Missouri, but by the time he finished, it would be Tom Benton's Missouri.
I worked nearly all the time for 2 years. It entailed traveling all over the state, making drawings of people. Not only that, but the design of the thing after I'd had my subject worked out. And I had to go and find people so as to individualize the characters and make them all look like Missourians. It took 18 months to prepare the picture and 6 months to paint it.
Benton sought models throughout the state, at county dances and church picnics, at political barbecues, honky-tonks, country clubs, down in the mines, out in the fields. He even attended an uproarious 3-day-old settlers' drunk in the depths of the Ozarks.
Part of the preparation was making a model in plastiline, clay, of the entire mural. And the purpose of this was to give it projection, and the other was to get a kind of a complete logic of light and shade for the whole thing. This is an old 16th century Italian technique.
Next, he drew a cartoon in exact proportion to the mural with all its details in place. The cartoon was then squared off with pencil lines. Later, each square was redrawn and scaled up on the house lounge walls. Benton painted in the outlines like a giant coloring book. He used egg tempera, a mixture of pigment and egg yolk that retains its color well and lasts hundreds of years. He worked from dawn to dark through the murderous heat of the summer of '36. An Associated Press photographer, Townsend Godsey, covered Benton's progress, and he remembers how the artist worked.
Mr. Benton would just be showing up, and he'd come in with his little brown paper bag with eggs in it. And of course what he was doing, he's bringing those eggs in to crack and mix up with his egg tempera. One day, a rather interesting thing happened. He was up on the scaffold painting, and Governor Guy Pork came into the lounge, accompanied by a black politician. Mr. Pork said, our friend here from St. Louis feels that we're not doing justice to the blacks because we've shown them as slaves being beaten. And then also there's Frankie and Johnny. Mr. Benton was a pretty good politician himself, so he said, well, Governor, if this gentleman has time, I'd like for him to just sit down here a little bit and let me make a sketch of him. And he says, I've got a place where I need another black man in the picture. He always had a sketch block handy, and so he made a picture. And the fellow left very happy and pleased that he had been so courteously treated. The original sketch for the mural didn't call for a black in this particular place.
This sardonic gentleman standing on the fringe of the political rally helped Benton make good on his desire to create what he called an all-round true and honest picture of Missouri. In 1936, Jim Crow laws and intimidation still kept African Americans from the center of power. Of course, the artist had to keep design considerations in mind. The marble door frames stood out too much, but he turned this problem to a formal advantage by continuing them into the mural space, imitating their color and texture. In this way, he also created architectural frames for his mythological characters, Huck Finn, Jesse James, Frankie and Johnny. The vertical areas between the windows presented another spatial challenge for the artist, who proceeded to fill the narrow panels with cornstalks and power towers to illustrate the balance of agriculture and industry in Missouri. The symmetrical structures within the mural clarify the busy scenes that move through time as well as space.
The man pitching hay is, of course, not pitching it into the Jesse James picture. He's pitching it into an imaginary barn. But he was put there in order to balance the figure on the other side. I want to explain to you that each one of these not only represents a human figure, but it also represents a volume in a geometric design.
The scenes and myths of the 20th century are featured in the second half of the mural. Benton witnessed America's transition into the machine age. While his father had no farm, it was customary at that time to keep a few animals. A sulky Tom had the unwelcome chore of milking the family cow Bluey, who grazes her way into immortality.
For that is the typical country life stuff in the inside of a farm kitchen where perhaps the son has come in and is cleaning up at the table before he's going to eat that pie that the old lady on the other side of him is making. There's an old stove and, of course, picture of grandfather on the wall, and back up and beyond that, we begin to move into a kind of a modern civilization. The big grain elevators and a modern wheat operation is shown there.
A cutaway reveals a courtroom scene, and Tom's brother Nat, who is prosecuting attorney of Greene County, argues his case before the jury. The judge is tired of the business.
And above this courtroom scene is the old Neosho courthouse. To the right of that, you see a tower which represents the mining industries of southwest Missouri, and you find the shale piles over there. When I was a boy, I worked with a surveyor's outfit in that lead and zinc district around Joplin and Galena. Below there is a modern miner working with his drill. This mass of smoke represents the coming of the smog of the cities. Now, most of the picture up to this panel has been devoted more or less to rural life of Missouri, but we have two big cities in this state, St. Louis and Kansas City, and this last panel is devoted to our modern city life, or what was modern in 1936 when I painted the pictures.
The St. Louis panel celebrates industrial productivity and the repeal of Prohibition in 1933, which revitalized one of Missouri's traditional industries. A worker pauses to test his product. Brewers, shoemakers, and garment workers go about regimented tasks without the self-direction seen in the citizens of earlier panels. While the workers spend their days in drudgery, the gentry dance to the music of a jazz band. Benton loved music, played a mean harmonica. Here, he nods to the great jazz musicians of Missouri like Count Basie, Jimmy Lunsford, and Buck Clayton. Since he was a kid, Benton had been fascinated by a lurid print of Custer's Last Stand, distributed to taverns far and wide by a St. Louis brewery. It hangs on the barroom wall of the Frankie and Johnny panel, which features a legendary crime of passion committed in St. Louis.
Well, Frankie and Johnny were lovers. Oh, Lordy, how they could love. Vowed to be true to each other, true as the stars above. He was her man. He was doing her wrong. Johnny reached for his Stetson, said, Lord God, Frankie, don't shoot. Frankie put her finger on the trigger, and the gun went rooty-toot-toot. She shot her man, as he was doing her wrong.
Whenever you think about Missouri, you not only think about Jesse James and Huckleberry Finn, but you also think about the quarrels of Frankie and Johnny, the love quarrel. So I felt that that had to go in.
The predella at the base of the Kansas City panel shows the misery of the Great Depression still going on outside in the real world, as Benton painted his own realistic mural.
There you have the stockyard, stock business, and you have a group of Kansas City characters who are at some kind of meeting. Now, this was one of the controversial things. A lot of people felt that these respectable gentlemen shouldn't be sitting in such proximity to dancing half-naked ladies in the background.
Benton told one critic who complained about the dancing girls that he'd put considerably more clothes on them than they really wore.
A picture like this has to put in so many things that all I was looking for is to get a general sequence, and you can make up your mind about the meaning of these proximities just as you please.
Cozy insider deals arranged by bankers, real estate developers, insurance men, and bosses have taken the place of the popular democracy seen earlier in the mural. Behind the scenes in Kansas City political life, but out front in Benton's picture, is Tom Pendergast, who manipulated city and state politics throughout the 20s and the 30s. The boss presides over the meeting, holding the foreground like a prince in a Renaissance mural.
In the interest of realism, I felt that he should go in the mural, and so I put him in there.
Most Missourians loved the mural, but everybody wasn't enthused.
I wouldn't hang a Benton on my outhouse wall.
There's no proportion to this stuff.
The people are terribly gaunt.
You either like 'em or you want the wall painted a deep black.
Too gaudy.
They're a waste of money.
There were some of the representatives thought the thing ought to be whitewashed off the wall after I'd finished it. But I knew that very likely, if the state had spent its money, they wouldn't do that in a hurry, and by that time they'd probably get to liking it, which they did.
By the time of his death in 1975 at the age of 85, Tom Benton had completed 12 major murals, from the Truman Library to the Country Music Hall of Fame. But his own History of Missouri in the state capitol always remained his favorite.
There's many a son of Missouri been cussed and discussed in these halls, but none more than Thomas Hart Benton after he painted these walls. Oh, after he painted these walls, after he painted these walls, none more than Thomas Hart Benton after he painted these walls. Some of our state legislators didn't like what he showed of our state. The James boys and Frankie and Johnny, a baby's bare bottom led sleigh. A baby's bare bottom led sleigh. A baby's bare bottom led sleigh. The James boys and Frankie and Johnny, a baby's bare bottom led sleigh. And some people thought it a scandal that he put old Tom Pendergast in with a half-naked hoochie-cooch dancer right next to a slaughterhouse scene. He put old Tom Pendergast in. He put old Tom Pendergast in with a half-naked hoochie-cooch dancer right next to a slaughterhouse scene. But Benton was used to such critics, and he didn't take long to reply. There's more to our history than heroes. There's also a baby's backside. There's also a baby's backside. There's also a baby's backside. There's more to our history than heroes. There's also a baby's backside.